Presentation is everything. When it comes to school, work, or even convincing a friend or family to see your point of view, the way you're presenting an item or idea will often affect your audience's outlook on it, especially if it's a first impression. This also applies to your personality and character, and how you present yourself to those around you is the way you present your character and will affect most people's perspective on you. Now, presentation applies to almost everything in life, but one thing that most people never thought it would apply to is video games. Presentation in a video game matters a lot more than you think, from the game's initial reveal to its gameplay showcases and demos all the way up to its release. What the developers say or showcase will affect the industry's outlook on the product. Depending on how much or how little information the developer releases over time will also determine how accepting the masses are of your product or not. Whether it's a shooter, an RTS, or an open world sandbox, what you say doesn't have nearly as much impact as what you show. Now, originally this video was going to solely focus on No Man's Sky and Hello Games, and for a few of the perceptive people in the audience, you probably noticed a few parallels in how I worded my script so far. But besides the pure oversight I would get for a No Man's Sky based video, I saw an opportunity to expand the topic of the video and try and do something a little bit different, given that it's the first video on my channel. But I do want to take a second and talk about No Man's Sky real quick. Now, despite everything about the game, its flaws, its shallow gameplay, the repetitive discoveries, despite all that, at the center of the game is a great concept with poor execution. And I want to come back to what I said earlier. What you say doesn't have nearly as much impact as what you show. And what has always interested me about this game was how this saying doesn't apply to No Man's Sky. Hello Games kept so much information from the public and only showed us a fraction of gameplay, and there was little to no skepticism. For years they told us their game was home to quintillions of unique planets, but yet they didn't show us much to back their statement up. They claimed that multiplayer was possible, but they never showed it to us. They had nothing to back up all that they were claiming, but yet they still persuaded people to buy their game, and I really never understood why. It wasn't until writing for this video that I really thought about this. I think No Man's Sky sold particularly well because of how Hello Games persuaded so many people to pre-order their game. This wasn't because of great gameplay or astounding feedback from the beta, because both of which are non-existent. It's because of how polished their presentation was. And while you're flipping me the bird for saying that, they sold millions of copies. So many games nowadays have the utmost quality in their presentations, an example being Battlefield 1. From the hyper-realistic graphics to its cinematography for cutscenes, and the actors' great delivery and expressions, and also the soundtrack. Everything in this game's presentation is top-notch, except the things that make that presentation matter: story and gameplay. This brings me to one of the biggest inherent problems with press conferences and game presentations as a whole. They're very informative, most of the time, and offer details and gameplay of their product, but they are often missing the most important detail. What they're missing is perspective. No one title is going to appeal to everyone, just the same with all types of media, nor should one attempt as much. Each and every individual has their own opinion, and that's what makes us all unique. If every person's point of view was in sync with one another, there would be no such thing as innovation or variation. Developers often attempt to hit this median or common ground among audiences in an attempt to make their game appeal to as many different crowds as possible. While most companies do this with mostly good intentions, it doesn't always turn out to be the best strategy. Consumers are seen through a one-way window, and their responses are seen through data. Not for the customer, but unlike judgment, feelings, and opinions, data can actually be measured. This ultimately influences a lot of design choices, whilst also weighing in the developer's own intentions. And this is where things like microtransactions and loot crates come into play. These additions aren't for the players, but rather to ensure that the developers can still make a profit off the most competitive of players, even if their title doesn't sell well. This data also affects how developers present their games at game conferences and what they reveal to the public. People can judge a game based on visuals, sound, music, etc. just by seeing it, but what they can't judge is how it plays and feels. Now, it's quite obvious just by watching someone play Doom, you know you wouldn't get nearly the full experience, rather if you were playing it yourself. The issue with press conferences and presentations is the lack of hands-on gameplay with the audience. These conferences are focused on marketing for their product, and they follow the same principle with the gameplay they release to the public. This is especially apparent with the majority of Ubisoft's gameplay demos, one of the more recent ones being the gameplay witness for Tom Clancy's The Division at E3 2013. This game prioritized spectacle over showcase, and, while graphics aren't something I specifically look for, The Division's demo really was beautiful. The environment was detailed to the spec, with every building looking unique on its own, realistic lighting and shadows, and even down to the falling snow on the ground. This game really was something to look at, and like I said earlier, presentation isn't just about the visuals, and while graphics aren't even bad after they're downgraded for the final release, it's the fact that they advertise the game with such authenticity. I am extremely thankful for all the content creators that do go out of their way to make these comparisons between the demos and the final release, because without them we really wouldn't get the full picture, and companies rarely like to show us the full picture. These comparisons really do show us just how guilty Ubisoft is with their bait and switch tactics. I don't know entirely why graphics are downgraded at launch. Besides Ubisoft doing it for marketing, I would assume it's to keep the full game at a steady frame rate, but that's only me speculating. And it really doesn't seem like that would be the case, especially with the hardware available to developers nowadays. It could be due to budget cuts or restraints, but with how often these downgrades occur, it seems unlikely. We don't know why this is the case, but with these big budget titles, it is still unforgivable. If the developers know that they can't utilize such authentic graphics for a full release, why would they advertise it as such? The more Ubisoft utilizes false advertisement for their presentations, the more they end up harming their product and their reputation in the long run. Not like Ubisoft had a very good reputation to begin with. It's such a disappointment to see so many developers focusing on the wrong things when developing their games, sacrificing story, gameplay, and depth for resolution, frame rate, and spectacle. Rainbow Six Siege suffered from the same degradation as The Division, and 343 sacrificed many of Halo's crucial gameplay aspects just to get Halo 5 to run at a buttery smooth 60 frames a second. And while neither of these are particularly bad games, they both suffer from misunderstanding of the consumer. And while data is the most efficient way to calculate perspective, it's only a shortcut. To have a full perspective is to go to an outsider to get their opinion. This is achievable through public access at conventions or public betas, alphas, and server tech tests, because you're not only achieving valuable insight about the state of your product, you're influencing your audience at the same time. The other way you can achieve a full perspective is to break the one-way glass between you and your consumer, to view the product as if you were its audience, to turn your presentation into your passion. People are able to read each other very well, not just through conversations, but also through expressions and body language. For your audience to see that you're passionate about your product is an invaluable factor into ultimately how confident they are about buying your product in the long run. To view your product as if you were your own consumer is to truly see the perspective most developers often don't take advantage from. I want to use personal analogy to compare this to. Let's say YouTube, for example. Making videos is a hobby I like. I enjoy doing it and I'm passionate about my content. Thus, I try to take and look at my videos as if I were my own audience. What I mean by this is when I'm writing or editing, I like to judge my video as if I were watching it for the first time. Not to the extent of downgrading my own work, but to improve my writing or editing and to make it more accessible from an outsider's perspective. I also take advice and criticisms from my audience so I can improve my content in the future. This is another rule of thumb I wish more game developers would utilize. Not because I think developers should lower themselves to fan appeasement, but because I believe following some constructive criticisms have the potential to better the experience. Titanfall 2 is a perfect example of this. Now, I never really intended to buy Titanfall 2, and I never played much of the first Titanfall, and since I only had time to dedicate to a single multiplayer experience at the time, I went with Battlefield 1, since I was already familiar with the series. And I honestly regret my decision, not because Battlefield 1 is a bad game, but due to the fact that while Battlefield 1 splits its player base with a season pass, Titanfall 2 is continuing to release post-launch content for free, and this choice was heavily influenced by community feedback and criticism. This also comes back around to the fact that Titanfall 2 announced that all of its post-launch content would be free just shortly after its tech test, and Battlefield 1 didn't dare reveal the content details of its premium pass until months after its release, while still allowing people to pre-order it. It's a blind marketing trick that I can't quite understand, not only for the developers but also for the consumer. Blindly purchasing a product that you don't know of its contents is beyond me. It's not justified to say blindly, as we do get a few details as far as how many maps or the amount of content included, but this information doesn't extend beyond this until right before it's released. If applying this tactic to DLC is scumbaggy enough, then it being applied to a full release game is beyond unforgivable. This brings me back around to No Man's Sky and how persuasive their presentation was, despite them not telling much about their product. The idea of a space exploration based game with no limits is a fresh concept, and while everything they discussed and presented was promising, they didn't show us much to back it up, and people were only left to find out how shallow of a game it was on their own, only after purchasing it, and that's the biggest crime in my opinion. I know I'm repeating myself from earlier, but I feel like coming back around to the topic I initially started this video gives a full, proper circle conclusion to the video, and I want to end the video on this note. Don't buy a game purely because the developers persuade them to. Let them show you why you should. I want to personally thank each and every one of you for visiting my channel. YouTube is something I've been wanting to start for a while now, and I want to invite all of you on this journey with me. If you enjoyed this video, please like, and I encourage you to subscribe for more content like this in the future. I'm Kuiperhawk, and I'll see you all next time.